Welcome back, everybody, to The Practical Woodsman. I'm Rut, the creator of The Practical Woodsman, and your host. That's right, it's my genius, which has brought this all into existence. This week, we're going to palaver a bit about why people die in situations that you think you could easily survive. I'm going to share the details of the first day of my recent excursion into the backcountry with several first-timers, folks who'd never done anything like it before. So stick around. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me again for this episode. I appreciate it. Before we get into today's discussion, let me make a couple of announcements. Got a dedicated online community for all things The Practical Woodsman related, and that's found on the Locals platform. It's a free speech platform. It's a really nice platform, so hope you'll join me over there. You can do that by going to thepracticalwoodsman.locals.com, or you can download the locals.com app from the App Store and just search for The Practical Woodsman. Locals, by the way, is spelled Locals. Announcement number 2, got a new video adventure up. If you ain't seen it, I hope you'll go check her out. It's available on YouTube and on Rumble. Remember, adventures are not the podcast, what you're listening to now. Adventures are me actually in the woods, showing off my time in the woods. So that is titled Adventure 13, Into the Backcountry with First Timers. So if you ain't seen it, go check her out. Let's get into the meat and taters of today's discussion. Why people die in situations that you think you could easily survive. There's a lot of factors, a lot of fine-tuned details that don't come into focus in any preparedness planning until when? Do you know the answer to that? From experience, do you know the answer to that? I do. From experience, I know that no matter how much you plan, no matter how many eventualities you imagine in your brain, and no matter how geared up and prepared you think you are, there's one thing that you just cannot prepare for, and that's for experience. There's certain things that just don't come into focus until you're actually in a situation. So you can think that you have every base covered, and you can think that you have absolutely everything you need, that there's no danger whatsoever. And then you get into a situation, and very quickly you find out the weaknesses and the flaws in your planning. It's happened to me several times. And if you're a long-time woodsman like myself, I'm sure it's happened to you too. To give you a real-life example of the reality of this happening to people, did you know that people, you've probably heard of this on the news, people who have fled upstairs to escape floods have been forced to move up even higher? Well, what's higher than upstairs? It's their attic. They get into their attics and they find themselves trapped. Why do they find themselves trapped? Because they don't have any tools to chop through the roof to get out. That's right. You see, in their imagination, they said, you know what? There is a possibility that we could be in a flood, but no worries, because we'll just go upstairs. Water will never get that high up. Well, water does get that high up. And maybe they even plan for that, and they say, you know what? Even if it does get upstairs, we still got the attic. So they get up into the attic. Well, guess what? What they did not anticipate is that the water would go even higher. It would go up, even up into the attic. Surely you've heard of this in the news, or during times of hurricane seasons and stuff like that. So they get up into the attic there and they find themselves trapped, and no tools to chop through the roof to get out. You see, it didn't even occur to them that that might be a thing that they might need to think about. The attic fills with water and they drown. Yikes. You see, they thought they had a plan ahead of time. But what really screwed them over? What really screwed them over was not that they're stupid. It's not that they're any less intelligent than you or I. In fact, these are folks who probably have lived around floods and water for large portions of their life. So if it's not that they're dumb, it's not that they have no experience whatsoever, then what is it? It's that they didn't have experience. They didn't have intimate experience with that particular circumstance. They lacked an intimate understanding about the true nature of that scenario. And because they lacked an intimate understanding about the true nature of that specific scenario, what happened? It prevented them from being able to truly predict all of the possible outcomes and prepare accordingly. Well, I don't want the focus here to be flooding, but I am trying to highlight the phenomenon of unknown unknowns. Who come up with that term? There was a politician who came up with that term. Donald Rumsfeld, it was. And a lot of people in the press gave him a hard time about that unknown unknowns. It's just jibber jabber. It means nothing. But if you think about it, it's brilliant. He says there's things that you know you don't know. Well, that even knowing that there are things you don't know gives you an advantage, right? If there's things I don't know about a certain region I'm going into in the backcountry, for example, simply knowing that those unknowns exist gives me an advantage. I can prepare to some degree for that. But what about unknown unknowns? These are things that you don't know that you don't know. You see, it was brilliant. And really, all the press that chided him and everything, made fun of him for using that term, really have showed themselves to be the dummies, haven't they? Because that's brilliant. Unknown unknowns. There are things you don't know that you don't know. How dangerous that can be. And the short answer for why people die in situations where you and I say, I don't get it. How did that person die? Because, we'll get into a conversation about that, but, you're guilty of it, I'm guilty of it. Everybody out there is guilty of it. Boy, that guy's an idiot. That guy's an idiot, died like that. Well, not so fast. Not so fast. In fact, if you're the type of person who would, if that's your default thought, is that guy's a dummy, that's why he died. That guy's going to go on get the Darwin Awards, right? If that's your default thought, you're the type of person who is in danger of dying in a similar way. I will say that with no jest whatsoever. You really are. If that's your default type of thinking, because you see, that type of thinking, which would ascribe somebody who's probably every bit as smart as you to dying in a way that you saying that would never happen to me, and the only reason it happened to that person is because they're a dummy, and I'm not a dummy, so that wouldn't happen to me. You see the risky mindset that a person like that is living with, or a risky attitude. The person who died probably died for carrying around a similar attitude. You see what I'm saying? So let's be careful about that sort of attitude. Instead of your default being, well, that guy's just a dummy, I'd never do something stupid like that, why don't you ask yourself, what sorts of unknown unknowns might that person have encountered? There are some exceptions to that. For example, I just heard about a guy trying to ride New York, I think it was New York subway, trying to ride on top of the subway like he sees in the movies, got his head knocked off. That's not a death by unknown unknowns. That's death by idiocy. Well, I shouldn't say idiocy. It was a younger guy. That's death by ignorance. Really, death by ignorance. You know, who of us in our teen years did not do something that we got away with that many others have not? I know I have. I did some really stupid stuff. It just kind of goes hand in hand with being a young buck of teenage years and being of the male persuasion. How many times have you heard of people dying in a tornado and you thought, well, why didn't they just do such and such? If I had been in that situation, I would have done such and such, right? That's the way we think. Dangerous to just assume that a person was dumb and that's why they died. While I was living in New England, remember I lived in the Boston area and there for a few years. I ain't from there. Of course, I'm from Appalachia, but I lived there. I lived in Philly. And but while I was living in New England, never forget this story about a woman named Ekaterina Matrosova froze to death in a snowstorm. I remember it being all over the news. They were looking for her. She was carrying one of those emergency beacons. You know, one of those GPS emergency beacons. Everybody thinks it's going to save their life one of these days, don't they? Could do a whole show on these emergency beacons. I don't like them. I'll tell you why I don't like them. I don't like them because they give you a false sense of security, as you'll see in this story with Ekaterina Matrosova, or Kate Matrosova. She was carrying one of those things, one of those locator beacons. She's in a snowstorm. I think it was in the White Mountains of New England. Think about her mindset. If I get into trouble, if I find myself too deep in a situation, I can always set off this locator beacon. But the locator beacon is giving you a false sense of security. So what is the natural result of that false sense of security? The natural result of that false sense of security is you wait too long to set off the locator beacon, because you say it's always there. I can set it off when I most need it. And so you let yourself get in over your head within those conditions. And that's what happened. I remember that it was just all over the news, them trying to get to her. One reason why she's probably in the news everywhere is because her husband is like a millionaire, banker. So I remember thinking at that time, there was a vicious snowstorm going on in the White Mountains. You might remember that I moved out there specifically for the backcountry opportunities, and once I got out there, I realized it wasn't like I imagined. First of all, I have no interest in being on a mountaintop with no resources and bald, no trees at a certain altitude. I have no interest in that. My interest is being immersed in forest. But here she is, top of this mountain, in, I think it was January or February, but I remember this huge storm raging up there. And let me tell you a story about that. This is not in my outline, but I'll tell you about it anyway. When I first moved out there, I had the great hopes of going out there to the White Mountains and just exploring to my heart's content. And I was working for this hospital as a Spanish interpreter. I was talking to a doctor about this. He says, you know, they've got cameras set up there on the White Mountains. This was in, I ain't kidding about this, I think it was in late September. Right, so anywhere else, if I were like in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, anywhere in the mountains in West Virginia, for example, in September, I'd be fine. I'd be fine all the way up into November probably. So I did not factor that in when I moved out there. Got up there, got started working up there about September, and told this doctor that I had plans for that weekend to go out to the White Mountains. He said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I was wondering why he sounded surprised. He says, "They got a camera set up. Let's take a look at this camera." He spins around in his chair there, got the wheels on it, goes to his computer, pulls up that webcam live from the top of the White Mountains. And I'm telling you what, it was a complete whiteout. A complete blizzard was raging up there. You couldn't see 10 feet. And I said, well, there goes my plans. There's no way I can go up there in that. That was like at the end of September. So this Ekaterina Matrosova, she's up there in like January or February, and during the snowstorm with her locator beacon, alone. The girl couldn't have weighed. She couldn't have weighed 120 pounds soaking wet. Now, it's interesting when you can go on YouTube and you can find video on YouTube of the search party going looking for her. The wind that's up there, it's like 100-mile-per-hour winds. There's these 200-pound guys up there with 80-pound packs on their backs, and you can watch the wind just blow them around like cardboard boxes. But there's this one guy, he's up like on top of a crag. He's slowly trying to hike down. The wind blows him off the crag, and he just floats like a kite until he lands on the ground down below that crag. It's unbelievable. So you think about Katya, 120 pounds soaking wet, and what that wind must have been doing to her. Anyway, my point is, as I'm hearing the news reports, I'm thinking to myself, well, I would just do this and this. I would just do this, and I would do this other thing, and I'd just be fine. I'd have this with me, and I'd have that with me, and I'd be fine. So I don't know what the big deal is. Well, they found her, froze to death, with her locator beacon. She'd waited too long, conditions got too serious. When they found her, she was frozen solid. But I had thoughts like that. Remember, the topic is, why do some people die in situations that we think we would be just fine in? Well, it's probably because you don't understand the true nature of the conditions, or you underestimate them, or there are unknowns to you that for a lack of intimacy with that specific type of circumstance is causing you to arrive at foolhardy conclusions like you would have done better. Not all the time. In some circumstances, maybe you would do better. Maybe I would do better. But most of the time, I think it's an overestimation of our knowledge of the thing and an underestimation of the true nature of the circumstances that the person really found herself or himself in. I said, why did she undertake that trip while there was the risk of a powerful snowstorm at a very high altitude? I said to myself, why didn't she just stop when she started to become overwhelmed? Why didn't she just stop, build a fire? Right? That seems easy enough to do. Why didn't she do that? Why didn't she get a fire going? How about this? Why didn't she just stop and set up a shelter? Doesn't that seem to make sense? Was she not packing a significantly insulated sleeping bag? Right? Another legitimate seeming question. Was she not dressed in plenty of layers? Did she not have more layers in her backpack that she could change into? If that were me, I thought, that would never have happened. That was in 2015, by the way, when that was going on, and I was living up there, and I was following the story with great interest. Over the years since then, I've learned there were a lot of unknown unknowns. Remember, I didn't even know that in September in the White Mountains you could have a blizzard up on top of the mountain, because I didn't factor in that altitude, that far north. Here's some other things I didn't factor in. That wind, you remember the wind I told you? 100 miles per hour, streaking across through there, knocking 200, not knocking 200 pound guys over, lifting them up and carrying them like kites, not like cakes, like kites. They're carrying 80 pounds on their back worth of gear, and it's just lifting them up like kites. Unbelievable. Remember, in the past, I've told you that, in my estimation, probably the most underestimated natural condition that you can find yourself facing out in the backcountry is wind. It's true in the summertime, it's true in the wintertime. Think about what your shelter's made out of. Could it withstand 100 mile per hour winds that can lift 280 guys who are weighing 280 pounds because of what they got on their back and can just lift them up like a kite? Could your shelter endure that? Probably not. In fact, I mean, unless you're carrying a log cabin on your back, I would say absolutely not. These things are made out of cloth that can rip. Ripstop nylon, sure. But let's say that you're hiking on top of 5 feet of snow. That's what your guy lines are going to be staked out into, snow. Those are going to rip right out, right? Even if you find a rock or something, rocks to securely tie your tent down, 100 miles an hour rip a tent like that to shreds. So that would answer the question, right? Why didn't she just stop and build a shelter? Why didn't she just get behind a rock to protect herself from the wind? Well, she probably did. I don't know. But if she could find a crag and she's got any brains at all, that's what she did. But it didn't keep her warm enough. You know why? Because with that type of wind chill, they estimate that with the wind chill, it was about 100 degrees below zero. 100 degrees below zero. And now my question about didn't she carry enough layers seems pretty ridiculous, don't it? Seems pretty ridiculous. How about stopping and getting a fire going? Well, you're above tree line. What fuel are you going to find up there? Under 5 feet of snow. What fuel are you going to find to build a fire? And even if there were fuel to build a fire, how are you going to do it in a 100 mile per hour wind? See, I asked myself all those questions, like, why didn't she just do this? Why didn't she just do that? I would have done this. I would do that. I'd be just fine. That's my thinking at the time. And yet, just a couple of years after that, so that was in 2016, I think it was 2016, so maybe even just a year later, I found myself in almost precisely the same circumstances. The difference was I don't carry a locator beacon. And again, I will reiterate that I think locator beacons are more harmful than good. If you're not carrying a locator beacon, what will the natural effect be of you not carrying something like that? The natural effect of that will be that you won't take unnecessary risks, will you? I mean, cell phones are bad enough. You say, well, I'll just climb up to a higher elevation. I'll be able to get a signal. I'll send a text message out. 90% of the time you can't. You can't get a signal. Not when you need it. Not when you need it. Certainly not in conditions like that. So yeah, I found myself in a similar circumstance. I underestimated the conditions where I was going. Got started about 11 o'clock at night in the mountains. I believe this was late February. Where I was, it hadn't snowed all winter long. And then, so that was a mistake I made. Assuming that the conditions where I was going were going to be similar to the conditions where I was. And that did not turn out to be the case. I got out there that night, and even though I was driving a Jeep Wrangler 4x4, the snow was so deep out there, I was afraid to park just any old where, because I thought I might not be able to get out of here. And I'm out there. I'm out there in the middle of nowhere. That is nowhere where you want to get stuck and have to walk for any length of time. And, that should have been a warning sign for me when I got out there and saw all that compacted snow. And it wasn't just snow. It was snow that had been clearly melting and refreezing all winter long up in those mountains. And I should have paid attention to that. I should say I could have paid attention to that. I don't like to say should. I could have paid attention to that and said, you know what? It's just me out here, me and my dog. It was me and old Bradbury, my dog, the one who just passed away back in April. But I said, I've got a lot of experience with this. I'm really, really good at this. I'm prepared for almost any eventuality. So, again, an overestimation in myself, an underestimation in the conditions facing me. Got about 5 miles in that night. Snow coming up almost all the way up to my knees. I didn't see any other footprints or anything out there. I was out there all by myself. Got to a place where I wanted to set up a camp. Tried to clear as much of the ground away as I could to get a fire going, and I could not get a fire going. And I am a master fire maker. I've gotten fire started after 3 days of pouring rain, in the rain. Notice what I'm telling you. I haven't just gotten fire started after rain and it clears up and it's not raining and I get a fire going. No, I've gotten fires going after 3 days of rain. Everything is absolutely soaked. And even in pouring rain, I've gotten all-night fires going. Granted, it took me 2 or 3 hours to do it. But, you can see that I would take something like that, build my confidence up in myself and say, I can get a fire started anywhere. Well, it's different when everything is absolutely caked in snow and ice that has been melting, refreezing, new snow coming down on top of it. And all of the wood you're having to pull it out from underneath snow. I know you all know the trick of going around, you find wood, and you see this on every survival thing, don't you? Going around finding hanging wood off branches and everything. Those were caked in snow and ice. Snow and ice that had been melting, refreezing. So listen, be careful when you're watching these survival guys tell you, oh, it's just easy. You just go around, you just find these hanging twigs and everything like that, and you get your fire going. Not every environment allows for that. Not all circumstances present that possibility to you. As I learned, I was worn out that night. I was tired. I was sleepy. I remember thinking, if I could just get 2 hours of sleep, then I would have the energy to do all this stuff I have to do. But where am I going to sleep? There's nowhere to sleep. Everything's covered in snow and ice. So I'm trying to get this fire going so that I can stay warm. And my next order of business is getting a shelter up. I get my shelter up. First of all, I get this baby fire going. Baby fire, struggling the whole time. I'm working with it for like 2 hours. Finally get this baby fire going. And I mean, I'm babying it. And it just wants to go out. Go get my shelter set up. While this baby fire is just dying to die, if you know what I mean. Get my shelter set up. I get over back to the fire to try to baby that thing some more and get that going. Guess what happens next? Wind, and not only wind, but freezing rain. Yeah, it was like the worst play of events that I could even imagine. You can't conjure up something like that for a story. And yet there I found myself in the middle of it, in the middle of nowhere with my dog and me. And I'm trying to keep my dog comfortable and from freezing to death too. Said, well, I'll go get into the shelter here. Get into the shelter. Guess what? Freezing rain collapses my shelter. No, I can't use my shelter. Freezing rain. What would you do in, let's say, 40-mile-per-hour winds? Freezing rain. Everything's covered in snow and ice. Everything is covered in snow and ice that has been melting and freezing for months. Everything is sopping. I mean, to the core, everything is wet. So the weather turned. Found myself battling 9 million things at once on my own in the middle of the night while all I want to do is sleep. All I could think about was if I could just get a little bit of sleep, I could handle this. Unexpected turns of events, snow, change into freezing rain, collapse in my tent, my boots soaking through in the shin-high snow. My feet turned into lumps of ice. My feet were very, very cold. I couldn't keep a fire going. My fire did go out, by the way, in the freezing rain. Of course, I mentioned all the wood was sopping wet, buried under snow, which required an incredible amount of effort to find. I had to shuffle through the snow and let my feet hit stuff underneath under the snow and dig down into it and pull it up to find it. A lot of energy. I was exhausted, desperate for sleep. I'm glad I survived and was able to learn from the experience, but I'll tell you, true, I suddenly had a lot more empathy and understanding for that woman who died in New England. I feel like I understand. After that experience, I understood her much better. I can handle this. I'm prepared for this. No matter what gets thrown at me, I've got a solution. Well, as human beings, we have real limits. And interestingly enough, there is a term for a person who can recognize their limits and be content to work within those limits. It's called modesty. Kind of an outdated word, ain't it? Modesty. A lot of people think that for example, that modest people we would never accomplish anything great as human beings if people were modest. But that's not true. You think about the moon landing back in the 60s. How did man get to the moon and back? Absolutely by being modest. And I'll tell you why. Remember what modesty is? It's recognizing your real limits and being content to work within those limits. Well, you know what the scientists of the time did not do? Do you know what they did not put their sights on? They did not put their sights on Mars. Why not Mars? Why did we aim for the moon? Because that was within our limits at the time of scientific knowledge and scientific advancement. The people of the time looked at what we could reasonably achieve safely, and they said, let's make that our goal. Let's do that. So they did not aim for Mars, they aimed for the moon. That's why we got men to the moon and back safely multiple times, because of modesty. So don't let anybody convince you that modesty is outdated, because modesty is not. Here's what modesty is not. Modesty is not putting limits on ourselves. That's not what modesty is. Modesty is recognizing what our true limits are. And a limit just is what it is, whether you recognize it as such or not. I can't breathe underwater. That's not me limiting myself. That's me recognizing my true limits. Now, if I want to do something underwater, I can create a contraption or something like that will allow me to stay underwater longer, but it'd be very foolish for me to say, that limit doesn't exist. Whether I recognize it exists or not, it does exist. So people who recognize limits are more successful in everything. Think about that in your endeavors in the backcountry. You want to be successful, want to come out alive, always try to recognize your true limits and work within those limits. Be content to work within those limits. What Katya should have done, there I go again. What Katya could have done, if she were a more modest person, is that she could have recognized that as human beings, there are just some things that are way, way more powerful than us. And Mother Nature's one of those things. Could have saved her life. But the other thing is unknown unknowns. That's a term you should adopt. Unknown unknowns. We all live with them. Now, they can become known unknowns if you first accept that those unknown unknowns exist. Now, am I starting to sound like a riddle? I don't mean to. What I'm trying to say is that in order for you to learn what those unknowns are, you first have to be humble enough to accept that they exist. Once you do that, then you can start investigating and make them known unknowns, which, remember what we said, gives you an advantage. Even if there's still things you don't know, if you know that you don't know them, that in itself is a great advantage. Here's some challenges I find to being prepared. It's kind of related to this subject. The greatest challenge for me, I think, to being prepared for all things involves two things. Number one, determining the best one solution system for every possible scenario. It can be one backpack, right? One backpack that will best serve me in every circumstance that I can imagine. That's number one challenge. Number two greatest challenge is the financial. So the first thing's pretty self-explanatory. I want multiple packs supplied with the same gear, organized in a way that will provide me with the best comfort and the best utility and the greatest number of scenarios. It has to work in all four seasons all the time. And I feel like I'm getting there after 30 years. I feel like I'm closer than I was, last year, and I'm closer than I was the year before. But it's an ongoing process, that's for sure. And every time I think I have my survival pack built exactly the way I want it, every single time that it gets put to the test, I find weaknesses in my setup. And I think of improvements that can be made. What's that? Unknown unknowns. Remember, we were talking back at the beginning of this discussion. There are just certain things that you cannot even imagine you might need or might be an issue until you find yourself in similar circumstances. And then you get an intimate insight, don't you, into just what the true nature of that, the specifics of that type of circumstance involve. Now, why do I talk about a one solution setup? Because you never know which circumstances you're going to find yourself in. I want to be able to grab and go at any time. You can prepare for winter, you can prepare for spring, you can prepare for summer, you can prepare for the desert, you can prepare for a deserted island. But how do you know when you're going to be in any of those circumstances? For sure. That's why I say a one solution setup. And secondly, the financial. Buying triples and quadruples of things, actually using them regularly, trying new tools, food options, and all these things is expensive. When I first wrote this, I'd spent $2,000, about $2,000, on refitting my basic regular gear, which after more than a decade of abuse was overdue to be replaced and upgraded. And this didn't even include any big ticket items like sleeping bags, boots, clothing. So in my ideal world, I would have, I think, at least 4 identical setups on standby with the exact same gear in it. Every single piece of gear down to the very last thing identical in all 4 setups because of familiarity. You find something that really works for you. You want to stick with it. That's the way I feel about it. Also, I want to be able to know where everything's at in my pack by muscle memory. I just want to be able to reach in there and know where it's at. And of course, every backpack you get is different, right? It's got different pockets located in different places and all this stuff. I would just love to have a perfect setup and to duplicate that like 4 times. So that would be, in my ideal world, that would be beautiful. But I just can't afford to spend that kind of money in that way. I mean, it's easier now than it was when I originally wrote this. I originally wrote this for an online thing. probably back in 2017, somewhere around there. So, but it all holds up. Financially, there's a lot of options like on Amazon now that financially make things a lot more viable than they used to be. It used to be like the real specialized gear, you'd have to get from a specialized gear place like REI, Cabela's, those sorts of things. So the financial that has improved, but still these things, by the time you tally up everything that you would like, the basic stuff that you would really like to have, that you trust, it's robust, you have a lot of confidence in everything. By the time you have tested all these things and tried them out and broken a bunch of stuff and all this stuff, it can get quite expensive still. Take lighting, for example. Once I settle on my two favorite lighting options, a headlamp and a handheld, that's my way to go. The headlamp is for all-purpose work. The handheld is for penetrating the woods, penetrating the forest and seeing at a distance. Once I've tried and settled on the ones that I love the most and that I trust the most, and I've narrowed down what I think is the best quality brand and model in those two categories, offering the greatest lumens for the longest battery life duration, and now everything is rechargeable. How you gonna do that, right? Well, in my opinion, if you're going to go rechargeable, you need a hybrid. You need a hybrid, because let's say that your batteries poop out in the middle of the night and you're lost out in the middle of the darkness. You're going to stop and charge your flashlight on a power bank? You're going to do that? You're going to wait around for an hour and just twiddle your thumbs in the middle of the dark with a bear chasing you or a Bigfoot, coming after you in the middle of the dark? No, you want to be able to just pop that sucker open, throw some batteries in there, some spare batteries, and go. Charge it later. So that's what I mean about a hybrid. If you're going to go flashlight or lamp or something like that, you don't want just a rechargeable flashlight or a rechargeable lamp. The only thing that makes sense to me is a hybrid. It should be able to just be charged off of power bank, but also you want it to be able to take batteries, normal batteries. Once I settle on my headlamp, my handheld, I can only really afford to buy one at a time. I can't really afford to buy like 4 at a time. Not the high quality stuff. Cheapo, sure, but high quality, like LED Lenser. Do you guys know that brand of flashlight? LED Lenser, LED, Lenser, I think it is. Favorite flashlight that I own is a LED Lenser, and the only reason I own it is because I found it out in the woods. I found it out in the backcountry. I just stumbled across it, picked it up. Obviously, it was had been used a lot then. That was 10, 12, 13 years ago. And still, to this day, it's my favorite flashlight. Well, those flashlights are not cheap. They're not cheap. That flashlight that I found probably went for $100. So it's, I'm not a rich man. $400 to buy 4 of them. That's that hurts a little bit. Plus the headlamp on top of that. Say I'm buying 4, $50 headlamps. That's an ouchie. That's an ouchie right there. I can buy like 1 at a time, right? And I've got other expenses and stuff like that. But once I get them, they get scattered around to strategic locations where I imagine I'm most likely to need them. But sometimes I have to transfer them from one location to another, from one pack to another pack, from my Jeep to my house. In my ideal world, where money would not be a factor, I would just buy a dozen and I'd have them placed everywhere. So remember the topic here is challenges I find to be unprepared. Financial challenges, right? If the financial consideration was not a consideration, I'd just buy a dozen of those things. Just buy a dozen of the same high quality light, have them everywhere. So then wherever I'm at, it's there. In my ideal world, I'd have at least 4 other identical setups on standby, like I said earlier, and I just can't afford to spend that kind of money that way. But if I could, I definitely would. Same thing with boots. I'd love to have a brand new pair of Merrells or Keens Gore-Tex boots, always stored in my truck, my home, my feet, anywhere else I can imagine. You just store those suckers everywhere. But when it comes to time to buy something like that, I can't just go and spend that sort of money on boots. Just buy like 12 pairs of boots. I wouldn't have money to buy other items that I consider necessary, like wool blankets, tarps, quality built packs, etc. So the result is that there's always a real possibility that I'll get stranded in a blizzard one day while driving and not have my boots with me when I go to fish them out of the back of my truck, because maybe I took them out to use them and they never made their way back. I try to be good about that, but I'm just a person. So yeah, not being rich is a real obstacle to being as prepared as I'd like to be in my ideal world. Now, let's talk real quick about, we got 6 minutes here. Let's talk about this recent excursion that I went on in the backcountry. Remember, what you're listening to right now, I call the podcast episodes. The adventures are me. I'm not talking to you on the adventures. On the adventures, I'm just spending my time out in the woods, and I'm sharing that with you. So if you'd like to see that, I know a lot of you folks just listen on the podcast, just listen, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, things like that. But if you'd like to see me out in the woods, it was fun. It was great to get out. It was odd being out there without my dog. People I took a good buddy of mine that I grew up with. His name's Nathan, and I took another friend, a recent friend that I've come to know. His name's Seth, and his daughter come with us, young teenage daughter. So they'd never done anything like this before, and we kind of threw it together relatively quick. I mean, we threw it together within weeks, and they'd never done anything like this, so that was nice. Of course, again, like I said earlier, in the adventures, I don't really speak to the camera and stuff like that. It's mostly I'm just trying to focus on my time out there, and I set up a camera. What I like to do is I set up a camera, and I like to forget that it's even there, because I don't want to feel like I'm like mugging for the camera or being influenced by the camera. So it's nice when I start getting to work and everything, and I forget that the camera's even on. That's my favorite footage, because I'm not being influenced by my knowledge that I'm on camera. Also, the conversations happening around the fire, stuff like that, are all very natural. So these folks I took, they'd never done anything like this before. I told old Nate, he wanted to sleep in a hammock. I said, this is not to badmouth Nate. He'd be all right with me sharing this. But I told him, I said, Nate, you really need to take something to insulate yourself, because even in the summertime, no matter how hot it is during the day, in the night, you will get cold. The air moving beneath you will take all your body heat out, and you'll find yourself very cold. Looking at the conditions and everything, the projection for what the temperature was, the weather was supposed to be doing. And at the last minute, I said, at the very least, we need to take long johns. Well, he was trying to go as light as absolutely possible. And he got very cold on that first night and on the second night, because he didn't insulate himself in the hammock. That confirmed to me that that my memory of such a thing is dead accurate. I remember doing the hammock thing and just waking up like 3 o'clock in the morning, just freezing. This was in middle of summertime, where daytime temperatures were like 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Alexa, what's 80 degrees Fahrenheit in Celsius?
80 degrees Fahrenheit is about 26.7 degrees Celsius.
All right, so almost 27 degrees Celsius. But even so, the hammock does not hold your heat, and because of the air moving beneath you in a hammock, just takes the heat right away and away from you, and you wake up cold. But he wanted to do it his way, and that's the way you learn, ain't it? Nothing wrong with being skeptical of what somebody tells you and figuring it out on your own. So we found parking that first day, loaded up, tried to decide how cold and hot. I did take some like 50-degree goose down sleeping bags. And at the last minute, I encouraged them to take the sleeping bags because the temperatures just at night just were not going to be up as high as I had originally expected them to be. So they took the down sleeping bags. They were fine. Again, I suggested that Nate take long johns. He didn't do that, and he suffered for it. Very cold on the first night. I did not put my long johns on the first night, and I got cold. I got very cold. On the second night, I did put my long johns on. Wool long johns. I still got cold. So on the third night, we got the fire going, ripping, roaring, and I slept next to the fire. I stayed cozy warm all night on that third night. Let's see here. We stayed up very late around the fire, had these deep philosophical discussions, had probably too much hooch, and of course that made for some more interesting discussions, and we got to bed so late that first night it was ridiculous. But like I said in other episodes, I'm very hard to pull away from the fire. This was the trip where everything started breaking on me. Tripod I took broke on me in the middle of the night, so I got like one day of footage using a tripod. The rest of the days of footage, you're going to notice I'm using my hand to film everything because I don't have a tripod after that first day. My stool broke. That really wonderful, awesome stool that I just been bragging on in other episodes broke on me. And it wasn't until after this trip that the guy I took with me, Seth, says, "Oh yeah, I think I stepped on that in the middle of the night." So I think he broke it. But remember, I did an episode early on when I started the Practical Woodsman, where the title of it was "Search for Weak Spots in Seemingly Strong Things." This stool, it seemed like it was bomb-proof, but there was just a small plastic part holding the three legs at their axis. That's what broke. There you go. There's another unknown. I mean, I looked that thing up and down to try to find the weak spot in it, and I just completely overlooked that. Well, that's the thing that broke. My UCO candle lantern broke. UCO, you know those candle lanterns? Yeah, I had a candle lantern with me on the very first night. Didn't get to use it past the first night. Didn't get to use the candle lantern past my first night. Didn't get to use my stool. And I want to replace that because even though it's kind of expensive, that was just it's a wonderful design. So I want to replace that. My stool broke. The tripod that I was using to film everything, that broke on me in the very first stinking night. Really put a hair in my biscuit. So I've got some replacements for that for the next trip. Lots of water on this trip. Water was really not an issue for the first couple of days. Drinking unfiltered water. Convincing the guys and the girls that it was okay to do that. Everybody was hesitant at first, but they quickly adopted my approach to that. They felt comfortable with that, and everything was fine. So you'll get to see that. Storms constantly trying to blow in on us most of the first afternoon, but rain never come on the first day or night. That came later, as you will see later when I publish the other episodes of that adventure. Coyotes on the first night. Very eerie. These guys had never been out there before. The one, Seth, the father of the daughter. He and I were up late. It was like 3:30 in the morning. He says, "What is that?" And I could see he was a little spooked. I'm going to let him sweat this out for a little bit. So I said to him, "What do you think it is?" He sat there. He said, "It sounds like a bunch of babies crying up in the deep, dark woods." I said, "Yeah, it's eerie, isn't it?" That is coyotes. So that was his first experience hearing them. Remember, I always describe them as being sounded like a room full of people having a cocktail party. coming down through the deep, dark woods. But because it's so far out of place, it's so unnatural in that setting, it's spooky. Morning poo-poo. So I did a couple of tasteful videos to illustrate my way of going about taking a hearty dump in the woods. And I'm going to be sharing that, not in this so this is Adventure 13 Part 1. You're not going to see a tutorial on that in Part 1. But in Adventure 13 Part 2 and 3 is where you might get to see something like that. So, something to think about and to look forward to. If you ain't seen that adventure, run over to YouTube or Rumble and check that out. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you joining me for this episode of The Practical Woodsman. That's right. It's my genius which has brought this all to fruition. Thank you. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.